Hello everyone, and welcome to the 5.3 tier list. This is part 4, so if you haven't seen the previous parts where we cover the subs, specials, and the mid tiers and lower, you can check those out in the description. Today we're going to be talking about probably the most controversial tier, which is the high tiers. These are the weapons that aren't quite the best in the game, but are still very good, and definitely have reasons to be used in competitive in their own situations. And today we're just going to be going over them and giving my thoughts on them. So, without further ado, we can get into it. Just remember that this tier list is for competitive play, meaning 4v4 in a team environment, not solo queue, anything can and work there, and that this is for the ranked mode splat zones only. Alright, starting off, we have the Booyah Aerospray. I forget the name for it at times. This one comes with a very interesting kit of Booyah Bomb and Burst Bomb, which is pretty solid. Burst Bomb is just an absolute big plus for this weapon. It really needs something to help it with its kill time, because the main problem with Aerospray is even compared to other similar spray shooters like Junior, its kill time is absolutely abysmally unreliable, so having Burst Bombs just makes it way better along with helping its mobility. Booyah Bomb is also a really great special for it, just in terms of being able to help paint, throwing it in a zone and being able to paint another, displacing it, gives it a lot of utility. The main problems are simply just that the main weapon is pretty weak outside of painting. And while yes, its painting output is very good, there are other weapons with very similar amounts of paint and better kits than this. The other thing to note is that the special is 190 on this weapon, so while it is one of the fastest Booyah Bomb weapons, Heavy does a bit better of a job, although admittedly in a different role. This means Aerospray is very limited on its map mode combinations to some things like zones on Humpback or on Black Belly, just because the main weapon is very limited. But the kit is still solid, and the painting and Booyah Bomb output is still fairly notable, so it earns its space right at the bottom of the high tiers. Next up is the NZAP 89. NZAP is a fairly solid main weapon, and you will definitely be seeing the other kit much higher on this list. As we talked about with the 83 earlier, the main weapon, while being fairly solid, isn't really anything super exceptional. The main advantage that this thing has compared to the other shooters of its range is its strafing speed being very good. Autobomb is a solid sub-weapon for it, and Antenna Missiles is a solid special weapon for it, but the main issue is that this weapon is currently pretty much outclassed by K-Shot, which is a much better missile support. The main weapon is overall better, the bomb is better, and it has more diversity in kits, and can be switched to being more aggressive. It's much better of a hybrid role than the 89 does provide. While they're very similar, as we'll talk about with K-Shot, it's just a slightly worse main weapon here. However, nothing about it is strictly bad, so if for whatever reason you wanted to play the NZAP 89 over the K-Shot, you could probably make it work. There just really isn't much reason for it. The Vanilla Splatshot Pro is an interesting one. While originally a lot of people can think to just rule it out by the logic I've gotten so far, having point sensor, the one thing that it does have is a 170p ink storm, which is actually pretty fast. You can run an MPU and 2 subs of charge up kit and be able to get fairly consistent amounts of ink storm, while still having a fairly solid killing option in terms of the main power up on the Pro itself. The main problems with the Splatshot Pro are its ink efficiency, which isn't really too bad, but it more can come into play when you use a bomb, which is why good K-Pro builds tend to have a main of Subsaver in there along with the main power-up. But the overall problem is, again, just not having the bomb on this kit. While the rain doesn't give it an interesting niche, unfortunately there's a weapon called the Custom Dually Sculptures, which does this whole kind of MPU mid-range weapon way better than Pro ever could, since Squelcher is one of the best weapons of the game. So again, kind of outclassed, but still has a bit of an interesting opportunity to it. If Pro painted a bit better, this could potentially be a very solid option, but right now CDS is just better in almost every way. Forged Splattershot Pro is a very similar thing to V Pro, where the kit is theoretically solid, but there's just another main weapon that is better with a very similar kit, in this case being the Foil Squeezer, which we'll have to talk about later, which is a better main weapon than Pro, while not being as gear dependent. The big problem with Forge as a bubble weapon is that you either have to run a special power-up build for your bubbles, or a main power-up build for the 2-shot, and Pro without that potential 2-shot is rather lackluster, while Squeezer not having a 2-shot isn't really that big a deal because the main weapon has more range, around the same fire rate, a specific painting mode. The only real less good part of it is the ink efficiency, which is very easy to play around. So overall, again, Forge, like the other options we've mentioned, theoretically, yeah, it can work fine, but in actuality is just, yeah, other weapons kind of outclass it. It's still good enough to where, if you wanted to play Forge, you could probably make it work. But there isn't really much reason to, rather than unless you can't mash with Squeezer. Next up are the regular and the Kensadulis. Pretty much everything I want to say about these is similar to the end parries. While their paint and overall stats are solid, dodge rolls leaves it very vulnerable because of its slowness, and it generally has more startup and end lag compared to short-range shooters, which have gotten buffed in recent patches. So overall it's a problem, and the other thing is the dodge rolls in enemy ink leaves you very susceptible to main power-up weapons two-shotting you, which as you can probably see as we've slowly gone up the list, is that there are more and more main power-up damage weapons the higher you go, so it's overall a huge problem for these weapons matchup-wise. Next up is the two Glugadulies. Kensaglugas actually has what would theoretically be the best kit in this entire game, which is Fizzy Bomb and Ink Armor. An amazing sub-weapon and an amazing special weapon. However, the main weapon of Glugas is very lackluster, and the main thing it has to revolve around is killing and holding areas, and the kit doesn't really help it do that. It's a very similar case to the Kensaluna I mentioned earlier, where the kit and the main weapon do almost completely different things, the only difference being the kit and main weapon are slightly better in this case. While the kit is theoretically pretty cool, in actuality it's still very hard. Outside of zones is even worse, even though it's not being ranked. It's important to note that when this weapon doesn't have map control, Fizzy Bomb throwing is pretty much the only thing it can do. And again, Glugas are very dependent on their roll in order to get a reliable two-shot. They don't paint very well, and they're very slow, so the kit doesn't really help it. The Glugadekos, on the other hand, does have a kit that helps it. This is actually very good kit synergy, the wall giving it an opportunity to use its rolls and wall out space without being as vulnerable, and the baller giving it another survivability option that can sort of be comboed with the dodge roll. Again, the main weapon has a lot of exploitable flaws, but in this case, the kit, while not being as good in terms of overall sub and special weapon compared to the Kensaglugas, has much better kit synergy with the main weapon. Overall, I think for Glugas to be better, it needs some form of having less weaknesses, whether they make it paint slightly better, have a little bit less lag, use a little bit less ink, something. Because right now, Glugas feel like they're just a little bit off being a solid niche. Still, they've been proven to be able to work by some very dedicated players who've been able to place high with the Glugadeko, but I still would like to see the weapon being higher, and there's not really too many results of it actually winning, just coming very close. Next up is the Octobrush, one of the weapons I play, and in this case we're talking about the Beacon and Tenamissile kit. Now, Octobrush is a very interesting main weapon. Theoretically, if you can get close enough to do damage to things, you can outkill just a lot of things in general. The weapon is very positioning based. While the kill time is slow, it's just very reliable. It's ultimately just all about getting in. But the problem is the meta right now is very much about keeping your distance. So getting in with Octobrush is the biggest struggle of the main weapon and what makes it so difficult to use in competitive play. Really good teams are very good at being aware of sharking positions and knowing where an Octobrush will get in. The good news about Octobrush is because it can paint very well and has pretty solid mobility, it can actually play pretty flexible and can afford to be more passive compared to other very shark-heavy weapons like Carbon Roller. So that's its main strengths. The other thing you would have to compensate for it would be the kits. And unfortunately, this is where the Nuvo kit half falls flat. While 170 Tenamissiles are very solid and fit the weapon very well, Beacons do absolutely nothing when you don't have map control. And when you do, while they're kind of helpful, the bombs on the other kits just help way better. Overall, the lack of a lethal bomb on a weapon like this makes it really hard. The other kits can poke with bombs more, use them to help with fights, and are overall just way more helpful in terms of closing the gap, poking other weapons out so you can approach, playing more passive. Not having the bomb is a huge downside that's really hard to make up for, and that's why it's here. Next up is the Zinc Mini Splatling. Mini Splatling is a fairly interesting and solid main weapon. It paints very well and has solid mobility, with the main weakness being because it has to strafe and has a charge time, it can be vulnerable to other weapons of longer range, such as chargers. And while the regular Minis kit does make up for this, the Zinc Minis really doesn't, with Curling Bomb being a just kind of throw sub-weapon that just doesn't really do that much. There's not really too much threat of you following the trail, it's just useful for escaping or positioning sometimes. Not worthless, but pretty close to it. The one thing that this kit does have is the 180p Ink Storm, which you can actually get fairly fast. While I do think this is a solid attribute, I just think there are many other Ink Storm weapons that are just better than it. The main advantage that this thing has is its storm output, which definitely is very nice for the weapon itself. But ultimately, this is where I think it is. Next up is the Bamboozler Mach 3. Now, the Bamboo is a very good main weapon because of MPU, basically giving you a one-shot because of a full charge, which is very fast. This weapon has a very similar problem as the Forge, which is that the kit doesn't allow you to run both main power-up and special power-up plus object shredder, so you're stuck missing out on something if you want to run it, and running a hybrid of the two usually isn't worth it. Fizzy Bomb is solid, but it can't combo with Bubble Blowers as fast as a normal bomb, because you have to shake it. One of the few instances where another bomb would have been better than Fizzy. Overall, still solid, but just a little bit too split in terms of its kit in order to be very maximized. Next up is the Sploosh-O-Matic 7. Now, the Sploosh-O-Matic 7 is the same sploosh as we talked about earlier, except they finally gave it a kit that works. As similar to where I mentioned with Octobrushes, having a bomb to poke to help get in and do things when you don't have map control is incredibly useful, and Hammer is a very nice aggressive special that allows it to keep playing aggressively, because Hammer will allow you to be able to survive by blocking shots and stalling. Throw-Out Hammer still gives it a bit more range. The special is aggressive, which works with the main weapon, and it gives it very solid options at being able to pop things like the 10 Umbrella and regular Umbrella shields or deal with slower weapons. While it ultimately still has a flaw of being very short-ranged, the mobility, solid paint, and aggressive kit leaves it in a fairly solid spot, and while you do have to be very aware of having the weapon on your team and knowing how to play around it, it can absolutely work in the right situations. Very solid. Next up is the Kensa Jr. Kensa Jr. is basically known for it having the best bubble combo in the game, because if a torpedo locks onto an opponent and a bubble hits it, the bubble will instantly explode, meaning unlike every other bubble weapon, you can combo with one bubble, meaning you can do potentially 3 bubble combos in a row, or you can use the rolled torpedo to combo 2 bubbles together, just as you would with something like a foil squeezer. This means basically it's really good at using its bubble combo. A Kensa Jr. that can manage to get in and use its special effectively is absolutely crazy. When it doesn't have control, it can poke with torpedoes, which are a very solid poking tool, and paint the map a lot. And when it has Bubble Blower, you have to be constantly on the lookout for where it is and not to get caught, as those bubbles can absolutely decimate your team. Overall, it's very solid. If it could get bubble faster like it could in the previous patches, I could honestly see it being a top tier. The main thing right now is it is still pretty predictable. Once you know how it plays, it's pretty self-explanatory, and while Torpedo is a nice bomb, it is not the best in poking when it doesn't have bubbles. Being able to run over a Kensa Jr. or keep it from getting bubbles too much, and as well as good awareness of when it has bubbles, can mitigate it. Still, there will be many situations where there isn't much you could do, which is why it is this high tier spot. Next up is the 10 attack splatter shot, the tried and true splatter shot that everybody knows and loves. Overall, it's just your average frontline shooter. There pretty much isn't much to say about it. Solid kill time, solid bomb, solid special, 200B being closer on the higher end. Ultimately though, the main problem with a lot of frontline weapons is it really struggles in terms of dealing with a lot of the more mid-range options. Fighting Nautilus is hard. Fighting Machine is hard. Fighting these kind of MPU weapons like L3, K-Pro, and especially CDS are super hard. So if these shorter range weapons don't have an option to play more supportive and not have to approach, they can absolutely struggle against some of the better, more mid-range comps, which is ultimately where the T-Tech has its big flaws here. And next up is the Kensa 52. This is a pretty interesting short-range shooter because it has wall. And wall is very interesting for short-range because it allows it to kind of bully or wall out other short-range or slowly approach, but it doesn't really give it a good poking tool. It overall creates a very different playstyle compared to something like a T-Tech, to where it's much more patient and defensive. but still able to thrive and pressure in some situations. It does have the weakness of struggling more without map control, and not having a bomb is still a problem, but in a lot of situations it does kind of work for the 52. 52 does struggle a bit more with armor because of its slower fire rate, though having a very quick 2-shot is still pretty notable, as it does kill a good deal faster. The other problem of the main weapon is its accuracy being very bad after shooting for a solid amount of time, which again, against something like armor or HP specials or Brella shield, it could start to happen and be very inconsistent. The special of Booyah Bomb is fine for it. It's a solid kind of selfish panic button that can help keep it alive. Pretty good kit synergy with the actual wall itself. The main problem is, again, approaching is very hard, and it struggles against more mid-range weapons. Being able to have wall does, again, provide it a bit of a niche, but in terms of this niche being proven to work consistently, hasn't really been proven yet. There's a lot of potential here, but not a lot of proven potential. So it'll be interesting to see how this weapon plays out, but I could definitely see it being placed higher depending on how it gets played in comps and if it ends up having more utility because of its very unique kit playstyle. Next up is the NZAP 83. This is almost my exact same notes as the Zimmy. Mobility with a fast Inkstorm, this time being 170 instead of 180, with a solid main weapon, in this case slightly weaker but faster Storm, with Sprinkler honestly being slightly more useful here than Curling Bomb, I would argue. While Sprinkler is normally a worse sub-weapon, I think it would just fit this kind of playstyle of being sort of aggressive but more just with special and outside of that painting, because throwing the Sprinkler to paint a little bit while you paint around is at least slightly better than using Curling for the same mark. So in this case of kit synergy, I'd argue the 87 kit does it slightly better than the Zimmy. Besides that, they're pretty similar, though Zap tends to do a bit better in terms of not as linear maps, being able to swim around more while the Mini has to rely on a charge. So they're better in slightly different situations, but still very similar. Next up is the 96. 96 is basically the Bamboo of shooters. You can't really approach it, but it has a hard time approaching at times. Though I'd argue it's nowhere near as good as the Bamboo is at approaching with its one shot. 96 is a very slow shot velocity, but it's very solid range, with Sprinkler helping to paint for a 190p armor. Overall, it's a pretty solid support option on the longer range maps, but it's very unreliable because of its RNG and its slow shot velocity, meaning the shots travel very slowly. It can get a solid amount of armors, but fighting is difficult at times, and it can also struggle to deal with armor because of its slow fire rate, similar to 52. Overall, if the main weapon shots were more reliable, it would have a much easier job approaching and fighting, which could make it a lot higher on this list, and is the main thing that holds it back, because sometimes it could be overwhelmed. Still though, when a 96 is set up, approaching it can be extremely difficult, similar to Bamboo, so it can definitely be annoying. If it had a bit better mobility or reliability, similar to some of the other armor supports like Zap and Junior, which we'll get to later, I could see it being used, but it does still have a kind of long-range maps niche that it can fit on, which is pretty solid. The other thing that can make it better is just having an actual sub-weapon and not Sprinkler. Next up is the V-Jet, the hailed worthless solo queue weapon because it's used by people who have no idea how to play it. Recently in Japan, this weapon has actually won an area cup, which has shown a lot of people how it is actually supposed to be played, taking advantage of the long distance pressure the main weapon provides as well as the high missile output. You can still get an insane amount of missiles, such as the Japanese player getting 12 on the Mako game, but they utilize much more of painting near mid rather than solo queue players jumping out and painting spawn for missiles. This is much more aggressive paint pressure that turfs over the enemies and provides much more of a wall rather than something that's playing passive and can be ignored. You have to approach a good vanilla jet, and that's the hard part. Mist is not a great sub-weapon, but it kind of has okay synergy with it. It's still not something you're going to use very often, but it can still help with keeping people away from you, so at least the sub-weapon can work with the main weapon. If it had a better kit, though, and a better sub, such as something like Burst Bomb like the Custom Jet had, it could be so high on the actual tier list. The fact that this thing can compete super well without having that good a sub is pretty crazy. Overall, a very solid special with a very solid output, and while the main weapon isn't as good as other backlines, there's definitely players showing how Jet Squelcher can be played to apply pressure. Similar to Jet Squelcher is the H3. While having a pretty worthless sub-weapon and point sensor, this thing has 170 missiles, which compared to the other kit of the H3D's 220p armor is a 50-point difference. And on top of that, even running main power-up to be able to get the 2-shot potential that H3s normally run, you can still get a lot of missiles, meaning this kit doesn't really conflict with it. You can run main power-up to get the better, more reliable kill time and aggressive play, and still be able to get a large amount of missiles, which is very interesting for the weapon. Again, if it had a bomb, it would be an amazingly good weapon. Overall, the potential is just on H3 players in order of landing their bursts. We started to see players get amazingly consistent with it, both in the West and JP, which is really proving the weapon's capability in terms of holding ground and getting aggressive plays. That potential one burst it has is a huge X factor to the weapon that has to be respected, and having main power up to make it more consistent in some situations is a huge boost. Missiles are a very solid supportive special that can fit with the weapon's more hybrid playstyle. Overall though, it's lacking in the sub-weapon category, and the overall weakness of H3 is that it is slow. Next up is 3 Rapid Blasters, the regular, Deco, and the Rapid Pro with Toxic Mist and Inkstorm. Very interesting kits overall. I don't think any of them work super well. The Long Nose Rapid has the issue of Toxic Mist and Inkstorm being average, Inkjet for the Rapid Deco not being great on zones while the bomb is solid, and the Bomb Rush Rapid is 200p, along with Mines not being very useful when you don't have control. The main weapons for these are all solid poke tools able to remove armor and poke mid-line weapons, which are becoming more and more common, such as CDSs and Rapid. However, the other 2 kits of the Rapid with Armor, the Rapid Blaster Pro Deco, excuse me for the long name, and the Kensa Rapid Blaster both have much better kits in order to do this. These kits are lackluster in many situations, and while it's also a blaster that cannot paint super well, having kits that doesn't help with those weaknesses can be a huge problem for them. So overall, these are solid weapons that can potentially work, but there are better kits. These are still very good enough to work because the main weapons have a very nice niche in terms of being able to poke distance and remove armors. Next up is Kunder. Kunder is a very interesting supportive weapon because it can take 1v1s with shooters. I previously mentioned that Undercover struggle at doing this, however the torpedo on Kensa Undercover actually allows it to take these fights, since it adds another factor that needs to either be shot down or more reliable damage to finish the kill quickly enough. Getting the kill will get you your shield back, which is enough to stall for help in most situations. Overall, it's a kind of aggressive hybrid, torpedo not being as good at poking as other bombs, but still very useful, and the Kunder shield allowing you to paint in some situations where you wouldn't normally be able to, such as charger sight lines if you need to paint over a zone, since the shield will be able to take a shot, and then you can go back under cover. So, it has some interesting niche options and some interesting matchups, but it can still struggle against mid-range, and the main weapon is still pretty weak. 200p armor is still not terribly slow, but it's not fast compared to Zapper Jr. So it's at kind of an interesting spot where it has uses, but still has a lot of weapons that arguably do its role overall better. Alright, next up is Slosher Deco. Slosher's a good weapon. I'm not going to stay too long on this weapon because there's not too much to say. The main weapon is very solid. We'll talk about it more higher up the tier list. Sprinkler is pretty useless, and the Baller is 220p, which you're not going to get very much for an already aggressive weapon. So, this thing is hard carried by the main weapon, and the special having some synergy with it. However, the sub-weapon is just entirely worthless compared to the bombs you have on the other 2 kits, and the special is more points for special than the other 2 without being majorly better. Moving on. Machine Neo. Good main weapon, good special. Stuck with sensor. Overall, it's solid. The Kensa machine is generally better, but sometimes if you want a splat bomb launcher, this can fit a niche for some maps. Again, more to be talked about with K Machine, which has the much better kit for the weapon, but overall Machine is very good at walling out weapons, poking corners, and has a solid kill time if you can manage to hit the direct, and has to be respected at a lot of angles other weapons can't fight at. Foil Flingza. This thing is another missile spammer, but this one's like completely missile spammy. Suction Bomb for poking, vertical flick will be your painting, and horizontal flick is if you're being rushed down. You can kind of be aggressive, but the horizontal flick isn't really as good as even the regular rollers, let alone something like the Carbon with Burst Bomb has in terms of combo potential. So it's very much set on its ability to paint long distance, with its main problem being dealing with stuff like chargers where it has to play around angles. The damage from both of its flicks is kind of mediocre, but the Foil Flingza has a kit to where you can play around it. It's just very hard since the main weapon has to be very passive a lot of the time, and being aggressive is very risky as your vertical flick is way too slow, and your sub-weapon doesn't help you with mobility super well, meaning if you get caught out in a bad position, you're probably going to die. Alright, next up are the regular and Kensa Dynamo rollers. These are overall pretty solid rollers. Their ability to paint very well with horizontal flick and have a solid hitbox is great, and its vertical flick, while slow, does give it some longer range paint and pressure options. If you get good at hitting over walls and in specific angles, it has to be respected. And with main power-up, its damage can be very reliable for 2 shots if you don't get the 1 shot. Overall, the main weaknesses of this problem is its slowness and its ability to be rushed down. The one thing it does have to help with that is the fact that its flicks on top of having MPU already do 180 damage, meaning these things can actually break Baller by flicking and rolling, or just flicking if you have main power up. And it can break armor doing the maximum amount of piercing damage, meaning even if the armored opponent will be able to live, they will be very weak and die to pretty much anything afterward. These weapons definitely could be higher. I overall think the kits are kind of okay. I think the vanilla kit is kind of outclassed by C-Jet, which is much better at ray spamming with a 180p ray, but we'll get to that when we talk about C-Jet. While the Kensa Dynamo's Booyah kit is kind of outclassed by Heavy Remix, which is able to get it more reliably and be more mobile with it. But as we'll get to with the Dynamo roller later on, it has a kit I consider better than these that we'll get to later. Next up is the Blob Lobber. The Blob Lobber is very solid for being a kind of crossfire paint hybrid. You have to respect the shots because it can deal a lot of damage very fast. It can help poke on armor. It's overall very solid. The main problem with the main weapon is it's getting rushed down is very difficult. Even shooting someone at a T-Tech range can be really hard because of how slow the blobs travel, and you need 4 of them to kill. This weapon is about keeping your distance, playing the map control, and playing around your kit. Wall can be solid but isn't amazing, but Inkstorm is very good for helping contest paint zone. Blob Lobber also in a lot of maps can lob consistent paint onto zone, meaning you have to paint over it to keep it from being contested, and it can help it get its special very fast. Main power-up helps with its painting capability. It does have a bit of an ink saving issue because it's very ink heavy, but overall still a very solid zones option. This weapon is more transitioned into kind of a weird backline role, where it's a backline that almost exclusively paints and pressures without going for kills, which is very interesting. Very high amount of special output, and specials that paint and wall out similar to the main weapon. Next up is V-Explo. I'll talk about Explosher more with the custom kit. It is very good at painting over zone. The 90 damage potential from hitting a direct plus the explosion is very notable. However, the kit on this weapon is fairly mediocre, with bubbles being hard to control and not really helping it, and Sprinkler being Sprinkler. Very worthless. Also, it's 210p, meaning it's not going to be getting too many bubbles. Explo can run special power-up, but other abilities generally are better, such as Swim Speed, Main Saver, and even Quick Respawn in some situations because of its ability to play very passively and not get kills, so when it does get rushed, it can respawn fast. Overall, good main weapon, kit's lackluster. Custom Explosher isn't a great kit either, but it's much better at helping the main weapon when we get to it. Next up is the Heavy Splatling. I'll be frank with this one. This is again outclassed by C-Jet, but better for some specific great maps like Kelp Dome. It's ray spam, but with 20 less points for special, a worse sub-weapon, and a debatably equal main weapon at best, though I consider it worse. I know that sounds negative, but again, high tiers are still very solid. It's just in this case, I do think C-Jet is better. Again, like I mentioned with some of the things before, if you wanted to make heavy work against it, you theoretically could. But C-Jet is slightly better. Even if it's not by too much, it's enough to where it's really hard to consider using heavy, unless if you were already a Splatling player. Custom Hydra. This weapon has to have its entire team basically playing around its kit, because the weapon is so incredibly slow that you basically have to play protection around it and play around its angles. The main problem with Hydra is that it gets outpoked by Charger and doesn't put as much pressure as a good Charger puts. Armor is a pretty interesting special for it, and 200p isn't too bad. The weapon can absolutely shred things, very good at dealing with being rushed down. If it was slightly faster, it could maybe be a bit better, but it's definitely up for debate. Hydra is the weapon that more than anything in this game, you have to have a team comp built around it. So, as of right now, I see it as a very solid option, but one that hasn't really been proven. Some maps like Schellendorf have been very useful for it, but it's been struggling to reach outside of those map modes. This thing purely just has the potential factor if a team decided to play around one. And last up in the B tier is Fresh Swiffer. Fresh Swiffer is a very solid main weapon, with a kit that's also pretty good. Suction Bomb is nice for poking, and Inkjet, while kind of mediocre on zones, does fit its kind of more aggressive playstyle. I think Nautilus fits this overall better, and the classic Swiffer and new Swiffer are better kits, but the main weapon is very solid. Being able to charge full speed in the air gives it mobility options. The charge time is fast enough to where you can get a second shot in many situations, making it fairly reliable, and the paint of the main weapon is very good. The other thing to note is main power-up increasing your range helps it much better at fighting weapons, as it gives it very close to heavy range, which is part of what makes Swiffer so good right now, is its ability to fight other midlines with an MPU heavy build. Last up at the top of the high tiers in A tier, these are very close to top tier weapons, and these are probably my favorite to go over. First up is the vanilla L3. L3 has a few really amazing things about it. Its strafing speed is very good, its paint is absolutely insane given the range it's at, and its damage with MPU is a very threatening one burst. Overall, a very solid, very fast main weapon that has a really good job against some of the shorter range weapons. It can struggle a bit against weapons that do outrange it. I'd say stuff like CDS is a tricky matchup for it, or K-Machine. But overall, very solid. And while it does struggle in those matchups, that by far outpaints those weapons. This is overall still a pretty weak kit for the weapon. Curling Bomb being pretty mediocre, but not being horrible with it, giving some mobility options, which can kind of be necessary. But Baller being 220p isn't really the best thing about it, especially when L3D has perfect kit synergy with Burst Bomb and Inkjet. It's overall a very solid kit that on some maps can be worth it, but in most maps the other kit's just going to be a bit better because of having that Burst Bomb. Still very solid. Next up is K-Shot. This is the support missile weapon I like here. It's overall very, very strong, in my opinion. I think the ability for K-Shot compared to T-Tech that makes it way better is just the idea of how much more passive it can play, because it has a very supportive kit as well. Being able to poke with bombs, with LDE, paint the zone very effectively, and not have to push up makes it a lot easier in terms of being able to play against that. And playing against more mid-range matchups, it gives it an option of playing more supportive, which can overall help it fit a lot more. I still think K-Shot is very much declining, as we've been seeing a lot less of Shot and T-Tech overall as more and more players move to CDS, Custom Duty Squelcher. But I still think it is a solid weapon that just requires a very strict playstyle and is very punishing if you make the wrong moves. Next up is CJS. CJS basically is the same thing as what I've talked about VJet, but now you have burst bombs for both defending yourself and mobility, which is a huge plus for it. Overall, I think it's just very useful to have. Great synergy with the main weapon. Helps its kill time, helps mobility, helps poking power, keeping people away, everything. Stingray is very solid for it. 180p allows it to get raid very fast, and C-Jet very much has a niche of being able to force specials, or on certain maps just force being able to move or tick damage because of the quantity of raids that you can get, with most custom jet squelcher kits having a lot of charge up and object shredder. Overall, very useful. I do think some maps and comps do deal with it a lot better. It's very dependent on having a good Stingray map, and bad Stingray maps can be very problematic for it. So it's overall dependent on that. I can still see this weapon being a little bit higher on the next tier up, but it just overall depends on how well Stingray can be maximized. Next up is Brella. Brella's definitely seen better days with all the nerfs, but it's overall still a pretty strong main weapon. Its ability to kind of just stall engagements and play slow has never really been reduced, so it's still capable of doing that very, very well. The main thing is its overall killing is a lot lower, since at a maximum range, getting 2 shots to kill is really unlikely, and it's much more often going to be 3. Sprinkler is also fairly lackluster. It's not that bad on this weapon, but it's fine. But Rain is also very good as well. I think Rain is a very nice special for this. I think Bomb Rush is a little bit better, but we'll get into that when we talk about the Sorella kit. Overall, still very solid. Some weapons and comps can deal with it very well, and with its lack of ability to kill, it struggles definitely a lot more versus a lot of the top tiers. A good amount of the top tiers have a good ability to actually fight this weapon. You have to be very good mechanically at using your shield and hitting shots in order to do it, because playing slow isn't as much of an option. Sorella Tent. Sorella Tent is really fucking good. Tent is a really amazing main weapon. The amount of resources and attention it can pull is just ridiculous. The one shot just gives it a ton of potential. And this kit having wall isn't great, but Curling Rush on some maps is just insane. Just how good Sorella Tent is on those maps. I'd definitely say this is something that's only played on a few maps. But the maps where you do want a Sorella Tent, it's just absolutely ridiculously good. Stuff like Skipper Pavilion or even Humpback are just very strong for it. While I do think the other tent kits are better, I still think this kit is very solid and very threatening. 170 Curling Rush is just going to happen very often. It's going to create a lot of space. Even if it's not as good as the other bomb launchers, you can get it a lot with this weapon. Next up is the Tri-Nouveau. The Tri-Nouveau has a very interesting kit. 170 Rain is very useful for it, and having a bomb to poke is good. I do think there are situations where this kit is better than the vanilla Tri, particularly if you need bombs to poke a lot, say if there's something like a splash wall or needing to get an area of the map. And Inkstorm could be very useful for stalling out double armor comps. Tri is a very good main weapon with its range of the middle slosh being able to outrange short-range shooters. It's overall a huge matchup advantage against some specific weapons. It can absolutely take a lot of them down and just has to be respected in close range. It's very similar to Octobrush in that regard, that if it can get close enough, it's very hard to beat. While Octobrush can be more reliable in terms of overall damage range, being able to hit the right shots with Tri will definitely kill faster than Octobrush, so it could be much more worth it in that way. While the other Tri does have a really amazing kit, this one is still very good and still sees a good amount of use. Blob Deco I don't have much to say for. Pretty much the same thing as the regular Blob. Sprinkler is okay with it, even though it's not a great sub. Except the Suction Rush is much more useful than the Rain, and I believe it's 10 points for special cheaper at 180 compared to 190. Might be wrong at that, though. But the Bomb Rush works really well for it, even better in terms of painting and stalling. Just tends to be a slightly better kit. Next up is Carbon Deco. Carbon Deco is really a weapon you kind of have to build your team around. It cannot paint very well at all. Its special is very lackluster. But its ability to kill armored opponents is what makes it absolutely insane. The Burst Bomb combo basically allows you to remove armor and immediately flick killing them. In terms of main and sub weapons, it is the most reliable way to kill armor opponents. And not a lot of things can one-shot armored opponents that fast by itself. Which means Carbon has a lot of presence and you have to respect it. More than any other short-range weapons, Carbon has to be accounted for just because of its sheer kill time. On top of that, the roll it has is very fast. Both of its flicks are fast, and its vertical flick has good range over ledges. Very, very strong weapon. The main problems are its special weapon being mediocre, longer range maps being poor for it, which is the main reason it's here. Shorter range maps it's a lot better, but some maps it's very difficult to use on. And overall, its dependency on its team, as again, it has very poor painting capabilities and struggles without map control. Not as hard as other short range weapons because you still have to respect it so much that you have to be super careful, but it still definitely is a problem. I think this weapon can be very map dependent, but it's overall very strong if you're good with it. I've talked about Dynamo before with the other two, but Gold Dynamo just has the kit that allows it to work. It can play a kind of backline, midline hybrid, kind of similar to Classic Squiffer when we'll talk about it later. It gets a good amount of armors. Armor is very good since it can quickly refill its tank. The Splat Bomb is very good for poking, and you can bomb armor to get refill your ink tank and flick to stall zone. The bomb can help defend itself. Overall, very strong kit, very strong main weapon. It does mostly struggle with more longer range stuff, having to deal with backlines or just anything that can shred it. But being able to play under ledges or in specific areas can help mitigate that, so it's still very strong and capable of winning. Alright, next up are the two Octobrushes. For now, I put these even with each other, but it's kind of debatable. I'm starting to think the Kenta Octobrush is the better kit than the vanilla one, and I very much debated moving the vanilla Octobrush down one, because Autobomb is a weaker bomb, and Inkjet is weaker in zones compared to Hammer. But I do think the 170 Inkjet and Autobomb has really good synergy with Octobrush. Just in terms of Autobomb, using less ink means you can flick a lot easier with it, whereas Octobrush, you need to be careful not to run out of ink after you suction bomb. And while Hammer is solid, just being really good with Inkjet can make up for it, and Octobrush works very, very well with Drop Roller and the rolling capability, so it's one of the better ones in mitigating its landings being camped. Overall, I know these weapons are very slept on by a lot of the top competitive community, so a lot of people are probably going to look down on these weapons, even though it has the results with winning SS Open, even though that was an all modes tournament, and Ballpoint was played alongside it. It's still a thing where on the right map modes, it's ridiculous, and it's much less comp dependent than something like a Carbon. Overall, it just has to be respected, but compared to other shorter range weapons, it's much more diverse in being able to mix up its playstyle, but with playing more poking with bombs or painting, which just gives it a lot more utility that I think is very valuable. But we'll have to see how far it can be pushed. For now, this is where I think it stands. But I could see it being potentially higher or lower. But, of course, I play the weapon, so I'm going to think that the Kenta Octobrush in particular has potential to be higher here. But it all depends how things go. Mini is another one I barely put in this tier compared to S. If I had to redo this, I honestly might have put it a tier up. Burst bombs are really useful with helping the mobility, since you can mix up strafing around with being able to burst bomb your feet and swimming, as well as damaging nearby players. Burst bombs overall combo really well with the main weapon and allow for a lot of utility. Missiles are very strong with it, and even though it's 210p, Mini paints so much that I can get those missiles very well. Overall, I think the kit is absolutely amazing in support for it. If you have an armor support already, Mini is a really good missile support secondary, and it works very well on most maps and against some specific comps. Burst bombs are very useful for armor and the mobility. This thing is very close to being S tier, so I'd say this is probably the highest weapon in this tier. It's very, very solid. Alright, next up is Nautilus. Point Sensor is very mediocre, but Baller is kind of nice for it in terms of being able to keep it alive. Nautilus is a weapon that can shred things very well at its range, and overall has a really good matchups both against short and mid-range weapons. Even though it struggles with some stuff like CDS and K-Machine and Crapid, it overall has a lot of good matchup potential, and just a lot of control, since you have to respect how fast the Nautilus bullets travel. I believe they are the fastest traveling shots in the entire game, and it's basically hit scan, which is very much threatening, and you have to respect it. Overall, though, the weapon still has painting issues without map control, and unlike the other Nautilus kit, which we'll get to later, not having a bomb is a big detriment to this. Baller is still very solid for it, but the sub-weapon being Sensor is ultimately what holds it back, along with its caping capabilities. I think Nautilus is much better on other modes, but for zones, this is where I put it. Next up is New Squiffer. So Squiffer is very good, as I mentioned earlier. I just think this is the same notes I've said for Fresh Squiffer, but with a better kit. Autobomb using less ink is nice for how many charge shots you can get quicker, and Baller is good for keeping it alive. I think it's overall just a very solid Squiffer kit. Overall allows more aggressive play, with the Baller being able to be used to bail you out if you miss a shot and position more aggressively. If Squiffer was light class and had light Baller, I would put New Squiffer higher a tier, but for now this is where I think it is. It's still very solid, very strong, close range charger, can bully a lot of matchups mid or short range, mostly just struggles with the longer range chargers, but very much able to play around that weakness. Bamboo Mach 2, Mist is okay with it, not great, but Bamboo's not going to use too much of it anyway. But this thing has a 160 Burst Rush, and Burst Bomb is very good at comboing with Bamboo, since it basically means you can partial charge, not even full charge, and kill after a Burst Bomb. It basically gives you a tool to be more aggressive, and because it's 160, you can get it very often. While I would say its other Mach 1 kit is better just because of how useful Tenta missiles are on a weapon like that, it's still very strong. Bamboo is still very much a wall that keeps things out, and it mostly struggles against the other chargers, or X-Splosher in terms of poking it out, and it's just very good at holding angles. Next up is Remix. I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure if I should have had Remix here. Part of me thinks I should put it lower. We're seeing less and less from heavies as other weapons just deal with it a lot. Now, so many chargers can bully it, with Charger and E-Leader already being good against it. Bamboo sharing its range, and Swiffer with MPU being able to match it. Point Sensor is already a lackluster sub. The main thing that makes up for this is the 180p Booyah, and the fact that it can paint better than most other backlines besides Explosher, but it can fight better than that weapon. It's kind of the in-the-middle, decent at everything compared to other backlines, but it doesn't really have any major strength. The Booyah spam is really the only thing. I don't honestly see this weapon being higher. I think it's definitely viable, definitely good. Obviously, I have it this high on the tier list, but I think it's very limited in what it can do and how it can be pushed. Splatling players need to figure out ways to push this weapon's aggressive potential, but there's only so much I could see that being pushed at this point. We'll have to see what heavy players can do with the weapon, but I just don't see a lot happening for it at the time being. Just kind of mediocre at everything, and that's not horrible in this case, like it would be most of the time, but it's not great. Alright, last up is the normal chargers, in which Splat Bomb and Ray is a solid kit. Ray being very slow, but being a better main weapon, obviously, with Charger being one of the best main weapons of the game compared to C-Jet. Overall, I think the Fire Fin is better in almost every situation, but there are definitely some times where you would use this weapon, and overall, the main weapon is still very strong, with the sub-weapon of Splat Bomb being a useful sub-weapon. Scope and unscope I have about equal, whereas comparison to E-Leader, scope is lower than unscope because the mobility on a weapon that takes longer to charge is much more important. Which brings us to our last weapon, E-Leader. I'm going to save most of our talk for the unscope leader, which is going to have to be in the top tier section of this list, but E-Leader paints much better than Chargers. The range is most helpful in zones compared to other modes. Ink Mine is very useful for holding zones and defending itself. Watching flanks works very well for this weapon, probably the best weapon in terms of kit synergy with mines. And 170 Rain is very useful for both quickly refilling your tank to keep pressure and painting zone. And yeah, this was a long one, guys. This was the high tiers. There was definitely a lot to discuss, and I tried to go into as much detail as possible without making this too long. But as you can tell by the video title, or by the video duration, yeah, it was pretty long. If you have any questions about these specific weapons, you can feel free to comment them, and I can probably give more details than I gave in this. But I hope you enjoyed. I promise the top tiers one won't be as long, but yeah. All of these weapons are very good and capable of winning, either pocketed or even one-tricked for some of the higher ones. So definitely a lot of interesting weapons here. I hope you're looking forward to the final part.